What's up, YouTube? Casey here, or in-game as you might better know me in hacker culture and the interwebs and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, we're making a YouTube video today. We're going to be responding kind of to the ethics discussion that Live Overflow and John Hammond had. It was an awesome discussion. I recommend going and watch it if you haven't already. It's really insightful to see opinions of two professionals in the field doing this, and me as a 10-year veteran in the field at this point. I just wanted to kind of chime in to the discussion. I felt like I had some valuable notes to add as somebody who does this every single day, especially in offensive security in particular, and somebody who has a knack for philosophy and ethics on the side. Not like I don't have credentials or degree or anything like that, but it is something that I have to deal with. I have to communicate with clients. I have to do responsible disclosures and things like that, and I've been doing it for many, many years now. So felt like I could add some value here. Quick disclaimer though before we dive into that. At the end of this video, we're going to have kind of a promo. I have something that I'm working on. It's about a third of the way done, so we're not even finished yet. It's not out yet, but I just wanted to make a small announcement about something I'm working on that I think you all really like, especially if you're a fan of my offensive security Udemy course. Yeah, it's related to that, something awesome in the works there. So we'll talk about that at the end of the video. I don't want to bore you with an ad up front. That's really dumb. So let's dive in. Now, for starters, we're not going to do the whole back and forth where I'm playing clips of the video and stuff like that on this particular video, and I'm responding to what they're saying. This is not a React video. I'm actually going to go through the survey that Live Overflow put out for this and respond in my own kind. And I'm going to respond to some of their comments as I remember them vaguely. So if I mess something up, John, Live Overflow, I'm super sorry. Didn't mean to. But they made this video recently, and John recently hit 1 million subscribers. So congratulations to John. If you've been sleeping under a rock in this community, you wouldn't have known that, but otherwise you probably knew that before I did. I still watch both of these guys pretty religiously to get some up-to-date stuff on news and especially Live Overflow stuff for technical stuff. All the stuff I learned about binary exploitation when I was younger, I learned from the binary exploitation series on Live Overflow's channel. It was super helpful. Some of the stuff I taught on my channel is stuff I learned from him. So it's kind of coming full circle. Sorry I missed you at whatever DEF CON that was 3 years ago when we tried to link up. But what's up, man? And John, good to see you again. I haven't seen you in a couple of years. You probably don't remember me, but we did some stuff in Pros versus Joes. So these are two guys that I super respect in the community, and I'm proud to call them colleagues in some respects, even though I don't know them super personally. But hey guys, really enjoyed your video if you're watching this. So this is me chiming in on that discussion here. Now, what I will be doing outside of responding to the video from memory, so to speak, is kind of going through to this like last discussion they had. Let me see if I can find the right point in time. This is probably close enough though. Yeah, so they did at the end of the video kind of go through this checklist of how they respond to each of these questions in like a speed round, because throughout it they did mention, hey, this is my opinion on this, I find it ethical or unethical, and they elaborated on it further and had this awesome conversation. So if you haven't watched this video in its entirety, I highly recommend doing that first, and then this is just me chiming in after the fact. So we are going to kind of go through this list and observe what their reactions were like I said, as I remember them based on their responses here. But first, we're going to dive into the forum that Live Overflow put out for this video specifically. So ethical hacking, what's your personal opinion or feeling? So I guess another disclaimer I should add in disclaimers. That was another joke in the video. It's like, does a disclaimer at the beginning of a video help at all? Does it do anything? And the general consensus is not really. Got mixed feelings on that. I think for all intents and purposes, no, people aren't stupid. It doesn't do anything realistically, but it is there to just kind of fire off an alarm in your head to say, hey, let's think about the ethics of this, right? If a disclaimer is there, that means something could potentially be unethical, or maybe it is trying to target a more ethical audience, and it's mostly there to make you think, but it doesn't really do anything, right? But in the same vein of disclaimers, these are all my personal feelings. Ethics are subjective, and if there's something important to know about ethics, it's that ethics are not morals. Morals are based in society. They're based on your upbringing. Morals are very personal to you, but morals do help define ethics. But ethics can be different based on the context. So ethics for a professional scenario can be different from personal ethics. And that's one of the things that I'm going to kind of divide today. Based on my professional experience, I do probably already said this, but I do offensive security stuff every day. Red teaming, pen testing, you name it. If it's in that sphere, phishing, social engineering, mobile app hacking, all that stuff is what I do every single day. And I've done it for years now. And while I'm not, I don't have a degree in ethics, I love philosophy, and this is something I think about, and I have to talk about this with clients from time to time. I have to talk about this with my peers. We have to decide, what is ethical, things like responsible disclosure if we find a new vulnerability. These are active questions we have to answer, and we have to decide on what our ethics are as a professional organization, and also bring into play our personal ethics when we're making some of these decisions and align with, ultimately in a professional setting, whatever the organization says is ethical. And your personal ethics, you kind of have to choose if you're okay with shoving them to the side or not. And obviously, if you want to work somewhere, that's a decision you have to make, is kind of put the professional ethics first in that scenario. So I'm going to kind of talk about those things as we go through these questions. It's something that I feel like I can add a pretty significant voice to in this conversation, in this dialogue. So let's dive right in. I believe these questions are randomized, so it's not going to be the same as what they answered them in, but I'm going to go through them in order and kind of talk about them. So the first question is a beginner-friendly step-by-step tutorial on how to use an exploit script for a 0-day is ethical, unethical, or neutral, right? So the idea here is that if you think this is ethical, then you think it's okay to do, there's no problem with it, or even that it's for the moral good in some sense based on what your own thing is. Again, ethics are not morals, so it's not good in the sense that it's righteous good. It's good in the sense that it's beneficial, or it's not causing a problem. It's not bad. To be good in this case is just to not be bad. And unethical, you think it's bad, it's wrong, you probably shouldn't do that. Again, same in the moral sense. It's not wrong that it's soul crushing to society. It's just like, probably best not to do that. And neutral is you could take it or leave it. You don't really think it's for the better or for the worse. And in this case, how I feel about this, the keyword that Live Overflow talked about, the nuance that I think was overlooked by a lot of people in the comments. I saw a lot of the comments scroll by. Some of them were having very good dialogue. Some of them made a lot of good points, some points that I'm going to make today, which is part of what sparked me wanting to respond to that video. But some of them were just nasty and, quite frankly, just stupid. They were completely ignoring the nuance, and when Live Overflow or John were trying to explain and talk around it, they would shout nasty comments. And that's the vein of the internet, right? Like, you're going to say dumb shit. People are going to reply with stupid comments on this video, I'm sure. And that's your opinion. That's fine. I think the nuance is important. You may not. And we can agree to disagree on that. I'm not really upset about it. But I, like I said, do think the nuance is important. Live Overflow thought the nuance was important here, and he made sure to call it out. He was very pedantic about it, and self-admittedly so. But I agree. The key words here are this is a beginner-friendly to somebody who has not really done anything. Maybe they're familiar with how to use the command line a little bit, or they don't have any background experience with the computer at all, and they can just follow instructions on a YouTube video to say, okay, you pull up a terminal, even if you don't know what that is, you can open applications, right? And then you can copy paste these commands, and then it'll do the thing. It's that level of beginner friendly that almost anybody, from your mom that knows nothing about computers to your 12-year-old cousin, doesn't matter their age or their background, if they don't have really any experience in hacking or security, they could probably pick this up pretty quickly and exploit this 0-day. So that nuance, that context is important. I do not find this to be very ethical. And one of the themes that you'll find me say later on in this video is I think the free share of knowledge is all, I'm all for it. Some of my opinions here through today, people might not agree with, and that's fine. But this beginner-friendly nuance, I find this to typically be unethical because it doesn't need to be that easy. I think releasing a public exploit script for a 0-day and even talking about the mechanics, like providing a tutorial of sorts, I find that to be completely ethical, especially if the exploit is complicated. Having a write-up, having some details on how to exploit something, I think can be valuable for both the professional community, just as valuable as for the criminal community. As a professional, I have to work and do research all day. If a new 0-day turns out and there's an exploit script for it, I'm pretty knowledgeable. I can probably break apart the script and figure it out within 30 minutes. It just depends on what it is. I don't really need the tutorial. This isn't really targeted at me. But if there is one, if there is a professional level tutorial that assumes you have some level of skill, it's not a step-by-step holding your hand, I would find that to be ethical. But this question is asking about a very beginner-friendly step-by-step tutorial, and in that case, I don't find that to be ethical. That can cause a lot more harm than good. It's not really for education so much as it is copy-paste exploit stuff. That I'm not all about, but I am for, of course, sharing a tutorial on an exploit script for a 0-day or anything like that in general. I do find that to be within my realm of ethics. I don't see a problem with that. Not saying that it couldn't cause harm. I acknowledge that criminal groups could use it just as well, but personally, within my ethics, I think that's fine. Not for criminals to exploit 0 days, but for that knowledge to be released. I'm within that group of I would find that to be ethical, but not as a baby step tutorial. All right, on to the next prompt here. Publicly sharing details about an unpatched vulnerability, for example, which function is vulnerable. So this is in the same vein of releasing 0 days in general, which are some of the other questions that we'll get to. So we have an unpatched vulnerability, and somebody publicly releases details about it. So this is, I've seen this happen many times where a new vulnerability will get announced, and somebody will have a write-up for it, but the write-up isn't to show how to exploit it. It's just to talk about why something is vulnerable. And it may leak details like, oh, in this, let's say for an LFI, for example, it's like in this line of code, in this WordPress endpoint, there is a file handling parameter, and that is where the vulnerability exists. And that is all the blog article says, right? Well, using that information, I can now go and look for that endpoint, and especially with an open source project like WordPress, and this is just my example, I can go through and I can find that endpoint in that code and maybe trace through the code and see where the vulnerability might exist based on the description of the details that were released in the blog post or whatever. Now you can take this a step further, something more difficult like say a patch, well, that wouldn't count, that'd be like a patch being introduced, but something like an unpatched vulnerability in a Microsoft product. Maybe there's a vulnerability in, I don't know, LSASS and some kind of process handler that it has, and that's all the article says. Well, somebody who's a little bit more well-versed in reverse engineering could go through and debug that process and find those function calls and eventually get there. Within time, we would have some kind of proof of concept based on that information. I think that's fair game. As soon as there is knowledge about a vulnerability being released of any sort, whether it's patched or unpatched, somebody, and they said this in the YouTube video too, somebody on Twitter or X or whatever is going to figure it out, and an exploit is eventually going to be released. There are very few times that does not happen. There are a couple of exploits here and there that I've run into where full proof of concepts aren't released, or that no proof of concept is released at all. In fact, if you go check Microsoft's patch logs for any security updates, you'll find some notes that say, hey, this is not being actively exploited in the wild. You can't find anything on Google. Maybe it's on some dark web forum somewhere, but for the common professional and for the common researcher, this information isn't available. But information about the patch, if you wanted to go research it and reverse it yourself, you could. I think that's fair game, whether it's patched or it's unpatched. So an unpatched vulnerability, I'm all about dropping 0 days. So if you drop some unpatched details about a vulnerability, it's vulnerable. And I think that's going to be the core argument that I'm making. And I believe Live Overflow had a similar sentiment as he was expressing in the original video, where the thing's vulnerable. It's a technical issue. There is a problem with the system in its design, in the code somewhere. It's there. Whether we know about it or not is the only difference, but it's there, it's vulnerable. And I would rather the broader community find out about it than it be hoarded by people who actually want to do harm. So I'm all about dropping them. There is some amount of harm that can come from that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through, but I believe it does more good than it does harm in that case, rather than keeping it a secret. And this is where the share the knowledge kind of aspect of my personal ethics comes into play. So I think it's completely fair game. It's completely ethical to share details about an unpatched vulnerability. It's not the best way. I have a professional ethics opinion on that, but I do believe it is overall ethical. I don't have a problem with it. On to the next one. Publicly sharing a proof of concept exploit for an unpatched vulnerability. So it's similar vein, only now we're not just talking about details. We're releasing the full exploit code. So this is what we would call dropping the O day or dropping the 0 day in our community, right? You're getting full exploit code. It's unpatched, ready to wreak havoc. I find this ethical because whether they went through a responsible disclosure process or not, it's now there, and now a patch is going to get made. Now, professionally speaking, I would find it better to go through a responsible disclosure process, right? So responsible disclosure based on Project Zero is what I always have followed throughout my career and all of the jobs I've worked for. That's kind of been the standard that's set. If I find a product and vendor software that's not related to my client that I'm conducting an assessment for, I will, of course, check with my client if it's applicable, let them know that, hey, we're probably going to disclose this to the vendor. This is a vendor issue, not a you issue. And then we'll go from there, and I'll reach out to the vendor and be like, hey, this is what we found. Here's a write-up of it, full details. We're not releasing this to anyone else for 90 days. And I take it a step further because my goal is to do no harm, or at least as minimal harm as possible. Once the knowledge is out there, it's out there. But again, the flaw existed whether I found it or not. And in that case, if I'm notifying the vendor, that's the best case scenario because at least it gets fixed. If nobody said anything, it would never get fixed. It would just exist, and eventually somebody would find it because I found it, right? It's kind of a cat and mouse game. It's hard to wrap your head around in some cases because people who aren't super into this kind of stuff may think that, okay, well, if nobody ever finds it, then it doesn't exist. It's Schrodinger's cat of exploitation. But that's dumb. It's logically there. It is a provable, logical thing. Whether we find it or not is up to the intelligence of humanity. And 9 times out of 10, we find it because humans are pretty smart. And we find a lot of vulnerabilities. So I like to release that or disclose that to the vendor, give them 90 days. And I'm even willing to take a step further. If they show initiative that they're working on this and they need more time, I don't mind pushing back the timeline. My goal isn't to drop an O-Day to the public and wreak havoc. The goal is to get the vulnerability patched. So if I'm doing that, then the vendor can take as much time as they need within reason. The thing, though, is if I found the vulnerability, especially if it was pretty easy to identify, who says somebody else hasn't already found it and is keeping it a secret? Or who says that next week another researcher won't find it and drop it anyway without a responsible disclosure process? So that's why we do set a timeline on it, just to not put pressure in a negative way, but to put pressure on a vendor to say, hey, this is a serious issue. You got to fix it. And we're going to give you 90 days. We're going to give you a timeline to do it to ensure that you're actually going to carry out the action, because we're in a professional world. You're a corporation. I'm working for a corporation. We're doing this disclosure thing. So I want you to fix it. I want you to actually solve the problem. And one effective way to do that is to put a time constraint on it. And at that point, if they don't fix it and they don't have any response, it gets released. And if they do fix it, or they're at least responsive and they're working on it and they're having trouble, I'll help consult with them and help them pinpoint how they might fix the issue if that's relevant. If it's not, then I'll provide them with more time and be like, hey, no sweat off my back as long as it's actively being fixed. My goal, again, isn't to just release the vulnerability and wreak havoc. But if it's not, then drop the fucking O-Day. It's great. Like, do that, because at least now the community is aware of it. Defenders can now make signatures based on the exploit code, and patches by third-party vendors who are going to fix it can come out. And while some of those products are kind of scammy and expensive, when they work, right? So none of that can happen if the information isn't released. So ideally, from a professional perspective, responsible disclosure first, and hopefully the vendor cooperates, and then you have a patch, then you release the vulnerability details and drop the O-Day and the proof of concept. But if not, if you don't go through that whole rigmarole, if I wasn't working for my organization and I didn't care about the target organization, it's nuanced. Like, maybe it's a company I personally don't like and I find a vulnerability. Maybe then in that situation, I think it's completely ethical to drop it without responsible disclosure. So in general, I would lean towards responsible disclosure in 90% of cases, but if a 0-day drops, a 0-day drops, and I'm not worried about it. I think that's great. I'm all for it. I think it's 100% ethical with or without the nuance. Lying to or deceiving somebody is, all right, This one's fun because they threw this one in there as a kind of like gotcha, because it's not really technical. We're not talking about hacking anymore. We're not talking about social engineering, even though that's where kind of the context of this goes if you watch the original video, because you do that in social engineering attacks. But I'm going to take this question at face value. Lying to or deceiving somebody is, generally, I'm kind of neutral on this. Why? Because life is difficult and you can't trust everybody you meet. I don't think it is ethical to outright lie to people, especially people you care about, your friends, your family. But if I'm talking to a stranger at a bar and they're asking me personal questions, oftentimes I lie. I don't give them, or at least deceive, even if I don't outright lie. I want to call myself a liar, but I don't. I will deceive to some extent because I don't want to give out personal information. I think that's just good personal and operational security for your person. And I'm a nerd. I'm a security nerd. So this is kind of default into my nature. I'm thinking about, okay, well, what could people do to me with information I give out? So I'm pretty quiet. I don't give out information that doesn't need to be given out, and I redirect conversations and I deceive to an extent. So I'm pretty neutral. I'm like a firm neutral on this. I don't think you should just outright lie to people or deceive people, especially for personal gain in ways that are harmful. But if you're protecting yourself with lying and deceit in a certain situation, it can be very ethical. Generally, it's unethical, but that's where I'm split. It's like, generally speaking, I wouldn't want to lie to my partner. I wouldn't want to lie to my friends. I wouldn't want to deceive them for any reason. And so I don't. But strangers, it's a little bit of a different ballgame. So I'm actually a firm neutral on this. This is more of an introspective question. I would encourage you to think about that. Do you think lying and deceiving is okay? Because as children we're taught, no, lying is bad. You know, it's one of the 10 Commandments or something, I think. But that's not realistic as human nature. So your morals may say lying and deceiving is bad, but your ethics and how you conduct yourself in society day to day, professional or individual, might differ a little bit. So I encourage you to think about that. Now, professionally, it's a little bit different. I would not want to lie or deceive my clients or my coworkers or anything like that. That's going to cost me my job. That's not good. Professional ethics, in this case, I think this is highly unethical, coming from a place as an employed individual working on a team with other people. But to me, that's the same thing as, not to say work as your friends and family. I don't believe in that at all. But I enjoy my coworkers, and a lot of them are my friends in this case. I like the company I work for, you know, and I guess this kind of goes without saying, these views are not, probably should have said this first, none of these views represent my employer. These are all my personal views. This is not reflective of them in any way. I'm not even going to mention my employer's name. But in a professional context, I would not want to lie or deceive my fellow coworkers or anybody in my company or my clients. That would be extremely unethical from a professional standpoint, but otherwise fairly neutral on it. All right, a beginner-friendly step-by-step SQL injection tutorial is unethical, neutral, or ethical. In the video, I believe they both kind of leaned on this is ethical. And the reason for this is kind of what I mentioned before. I agreed pretty heavily with Live Overflow on the fact that it is a system flaw. Like, this is a logical flaw that is built into the nature of technology when something is improperly developed with a SQL injection vulnerability. So a beginner-friendly step-by-step SQL injection tutorial, I agree with them on this, as we'll go back through. It is ethical. And it's entirely ethical because you're teaching a new skill. You're teaching how to identify what a SQL injection is and how to exploit that. Sure, one thing they kind of glossed over in the video is they pretty firmly said that's not you can't just take that and apply it to a page. It's kind of true. I mean, it's not the early 2000s anymore, right? You can't just do or 1 = 1 payload in every field and be dumping databases anymore, right? That's not how it works. We have a lot of ORMs. We have a lot of more educated developers because of things like teaching them what SQL injection is and how to exploit it. A lot of good things there. But can you take SQL injection payloads from a beginner tutorial and just spray them at websites and just put them into any input field as you're browsing around? I mean, there's some shitty websites at like colleges and schools and government that can get you in a lot of trouble if you're just doing that. So I think some harm can come from it, but I think it's pretty small. I think it is pretty small, and I think it's worthwhile still to have these tutorials teach you the fundamentals, because while my point is that it's not entirely untrue that you can't just copy and paste, you can. I think that happening effectively is so inefficient and so unlikely these days that it's kind of a moot point, and that's probably why they didn't talk about it, but I don't want to disregard it entirely. I did want to kind of mention that it could still potentially be harmful, but realistically, you're not going to be able to take what you learn from a step-by-step SQL injection tutorial and apply that to every web application you see. That's not how it works, and that was the point they made, and that I do agree with. In general, that's not how it works. There are edge cases, it's worth noting, but in general, you're not going to be able to take what you learned and just copy-paste it on a website from a beginner tutorial. What you will be able to do is take the knowledge on how SQL injection works, and if you actually understood it from the tutorial, now you can fuzz websites and you can fuzz applications and look for those parameters that might be vulnerable. You can look for errors that might indicate things, and you can understand SQL syntax better. And you should actually go learn SQL to be better at SQL injection. And I'll talk about this a little bit more. When we talk about malware, in the malware question, you should learn how to program. That's how you write malware, because malware is just software. So same thing here. SQL injection tutorial, I think it's completely ethical. I don't think there's any problem with that. Sharing proof of concept exploit for a patched vulnerability. I've already said that a proof of concept for an ODE is ethical. I would be a hypocrite if I said this wasn't ethical. I think this is perfectly ethical. It's already patched. Patches out there. If you're not patching it as an organization, that's on you. That's your poor security hygiene. I don't want to say, we're not victim blaming here, right? So a criminal attacking you with any exploit or with any attack path is bad. That's not your fault. You were a targeted victim of that. But you're also an organization that is responsible for other people's data. So you do own some responsibility in making sure your systems are secure. And if a patch is released and you just didn't patch, that is on you at that point. It's one thing if it's an ODE or new vulnerability. It's one thing if it's a new patch. Live Overflow talked about this timeline, and it's fairly true that we see in our communities and in organizations where a new vulnerability is released and a patch is released, and then the exploitation trend kind of goes down. It never goes away, but that's only because people don't patch. The amount of times I've exploited I won't even say Eternal Blue, but even the Conficker worm, the MS08067, in the last 2 years, I'll say has not been zero. Both of those vulnerabilities. It's been more than once, and it has not been zero. Imagine how long it's going to take to fully patch new vulnerabilities. It's insane. So it's never going to go away. But it's on the organizations, if a patch is released, to implement the patch. My teams, even, when we get a new vulnerability released and it affects our infrastructure, we make sure we patch right away, even at a detriment sometimes. We'll at least roll out some kind of mitigation in between while we're figuring out what's breaking. Some patches do break things, so I understand hesitancy, but if you're not geared for patching, some of that responsibility is on you, and that's why the U.S. CERT, that's why the government itself will fine organizations for not patching, for losing data and stuff like that, because you are responsible for other people's data and resources. You can't just never patch. That's negligence. You may be the victim of an attack, but you are also responsible for securing your systems. This isn't the same kind of argument as a social attack or somebody like being murdered or stolen from or worse. It's not quite the same thing. There is a technical solution to a technical problem. Sure, if somebody attacked you for a non-technical gain but used technical resources that could have been fixed, that's kind of where that comes into play. So yeah, I talked way too long about that, but I kind of wanted to talk about that even further in terms of ethics in that conversation, because obviously I think dropping an ODE is perfectly viable. So of course, dropping an exploit for a patch vulnerability is. All right, a beginner-friendly step-by-step malware development tutorial is, here we go. So here goes back to the nuance again, right? A beginner-friendly step-by-step malware development tutorial. I think that's unethical. I think you should be learning to program. If you can program, you can write malware. If you can make a web request to a server and issue a response, you're 3/4 of the way to writing a C2. The only thing you're missing is command execution and handling multiple sessions if you even are worried about that. Go learn web development. Go learn how to run system commands. Go learn how to automate things. Go learn how to program. And then you can write whatever you want, because malware is just software. We put this big, scary word of malware around software that does bad things. You know what ransomware is? It's a encryption and decryption utility. Or I guess in the case of an attack, it's encryption only till you pay up, and then they'll decrypt it for you. But that's all they did. They wrote a piece of software that encrypts files, and then on the back end, they have a piece of software that decrypts the files. Guess what does that? Your operating system, file vault, BitLocker, even in-transit encryption, SSL, TLS. It's just encryption algorithms wrapped in code to encrypt data. Learn how to program. If you learn how to program, you can write those kind of things. It's not, I'm demystifying it. Hopefully that didn't blow your brain open too much. I just told you what that is. Like, it's not anything crazy. There's no spooky magic going on. Now, there are techniques. There are some really crazy things with DLL injection, process injection, hijacking memory. There are some super complicated technical techniques when it comes to malware development that I think are spooky voodoo magic, as John kind of like jokingly says. It's like there is some witchcraft there. And I've only recently dived into a lot of that stuff in the past 2 years, and it's fun. I'm getting a lot out of it. But for most software, it's not necessary. If you want to do something, if you want to write a simple piece of malware, it's just software. Write a piece of software that does something, and then use it for something bad. Now you've made it malware. And so that's the age-old argument of is a gun bad? Well, depends on what you use it for. If you're using it to hunt, if that's your thing, maybe not. If you're using it to kill people, yeah, it's pretty bad, right? But malware is just software. If you use TeamViewer to hack somebody, to take over their computer via manipulation or whatever, pretty shitty of you. But TeamViewer is just a piece of software. And Live Overflow talked about some of the German rules and regulations and how they define what malicious software was. And I think the fact that they did that at all is pretty dumb, honestly. Like, no hate to the German government or anything like that. I don't have any opinion on politics. But the reason I think it's dumb is because it's software. And the fact that they can outright say, okay, software that was developed with an intention to do X, Y, or Z is bad. And then they can be like, oh yeah, but if it's for professional use cases, or if it's for, or if it can do stuff like it's just SSH, it's not necessarily falling under the statute. And I get what they're trying to do. And John and Live Overflow, they talked about this in the video a little bit more, with a little bit more depth than I'm going to, but I get what they're going for. They're going for, if you just wrote a remote access Trojan with something like a automatic piece of ransomware or something built in and just easy to deploy and stuff like that, that's pretty demonstrably effective at causing harm. And they're trying to prevent that. The only problem with that is, Metasploit is a tool for professionals, right? And they don't consider that, or Nmap or anything like that. It would be hilarious if it was Nmap, but tools that are established already as part of, the Kali Linux tool set, for example, are not considered within that law that was being referenced. If I write a tool for professionals, it just so happens to be open source, that does some of these things. Maybe it does, even to the degree of ransomware, but maybe it's safe. I do that for clients. So I put quotes around that, but clients ask me to demonstrate a ransomware attack on their systems from time to time. And I do it in a way that's safe. I rolled my own ransomware, so that way I can show, just an example, hey, I'm going to encrypt this SMB share. And the way I do it is I encrypt the files, but I don't delete the files, right? You don't want to do that. And I show how I can decrypt the files, just see if they can catch it. See if they have any of their tooling, if their EDR solutions are checking for that rogue software running, if they're checking for new file creations, if they're checking for encryption functions being running, anything like that. That's what we're checking for. I could write a tool suite that does that, and it's all you got to do is remove one line of code to change that. But it was a professional tool. What was your intention? It's you as the individual using the tool. You decided what to do with that. it is hairy, right? You need to make sure that your tool isn't just outright doing something nefarious by default. You don't want to build malevolence into a tool, but it's software. It's kind of hard to do that. If you're able to build malevolence into a tool, that means you've deployed it already. You've built it deployment ready for something that you intend to cause harm with. And as soon as anybody runs it, it is going to cause harm in a way that is active, which means you already have to have servers running for that. You already have to have infrastructure in place to capture data and wreak havoc. It's already in place. You did it, but just releasing code, even proof of concepts, it's code, it's software. So I'm pretty firm with releasing software of any sort, no matter what its functionality is, because there's no nature to software. That's my argument. That's personally what I think. You may disagree. It's fine. I know that's a very hot take, and that'll lead towards what I'm going to talk about at the end of the video. So if you agree with that hot take, stay tuned. However, back to this question, a beginner-friendly step-by-step tutorial? No. Beginner-friendly, if we're going with that nuance, no, I'm not for that. I don't think that's ethical. I think you should be learning to program. Go learn to program. You'll get a lot more benefit out of that. You don't want to just write malware. You can go get a job making buku bucks at whatever company if you can just write software. And you can take that a step further and be an awesome security professional with great background and programming knowledge. It'll help you find vulnerabilities better, and it'll help you write your own tools like malware because you already know how to program. So go learn how to program. Don't release tutorials on how to write malwares that target beginners. I don't think that's ethical at all. All right. Can there be unethical hacking tutorials and courses in general? I've said, yeah. I think if you made those beginner tutorials, I think those are fairly unethical. I do think spreading knowledge and information in general is perfectly ethical. I see no issue with that. I'm all for the freedom of public information, that whole hacker culture mindset. I'm all about it. I'm a hacker, dude. Like, what do you expect? At the same time, I do think it's pretty black and white that there can be some unethical hacking tutorials, whether I look at it from a professional perspective or look at it from my own personal ethics. A beginner-friendly step-by-step malware development tutorial is unethical, and down here we have this beginner-friendly step-by-step phishing tutorial. I also think that's unethical. There can certainly be unethical hacking tutorials and courses in general. And the last one, a beginner-friendly step-by-step phishing tutorial it's beginner-friendly, right? Unethical. Now, Live Overflow makes a pretty hardcore argument for, well, I say hardcore, he's actually pretty... What I loved about John and Live Overflow's conversations, they were both very clear. These are my stances, and this is where I'm set in, but I'm not upset at somebody else for having a different opinion on this. I recognize that maybe my opinion's the hot take. Like they express that very well, and I'm very inspired by that dialogue. I think they had a very healthy dialogue about ethics, because a lot of people get riled up. I saw a lot of comments that were very riled up. I hope I have a lot of riled up comments on this in regards to ethics. But Live Overflow's opinion on this is that he was thinking of the young him, the 16-year-old, the 13-year-old, whatever, the younger version of him, what kind of damage they would have done, just not knowing that it causes significant damage. And to Live Overflow doesn't really agree with social engineering or phishing in general. We differ in opinion there. I do social engineering as part of my engagements. It's an agreed upon thing. Now, he does clarify that both John and Live Overflow do clarify. It's like, okay, if it's agreed upon thing that employees know about, it's fair game. But it's never not that. In a professional context, it is always pre-scoped. Somebody is aware of it. Maybe your employees aren't, but there's benefit to that. So my argument to not notifying your employees, and if your employees have zero training on this kind of stuff, is that may be the point, is to demonstrate impact. That might be the goal of the red team, is to demonstrate impact if you execute this social engineering attack, whether it's vishing or phishing or breaking and entering into a building, whatever have you, as long as it's within the scope and it's agreed upon and your lawyers all agree and everybody's happy, whoever runs the organization is well within their right to execute those kind of attacks. And the benefit of doing that in that way is to present the data and be like, hey, we got in these ways, these attack paths were helpful, because at the end of the day, criminals don't care. Now, there is a professional limitation to this. You can't just walk in and hold a gun to somebody's head, for example. That would be just flat out breaking the law. There is no, a breaking and entering attempt that is authorized just means you are allowed to lockpick the door. I'm allowed to lockpick the door of my own house. Now, some states, lockpicks may or may not be legal, but in general, it's my property. I can kind of do what I want. So if the owner of that property is allowing me to act on their behalf to do those things, I'm not really breaking and entering anymore, at least not from a legal perspective, but I am demonstrating how a real criminal might do something like that. And a real criminal, Live Overflow and John both talked about this, like that maybe they extort somebody, maybe they are trying to blackmail somebody. We won't do that. There are professional ethical boundaries to this, and I think it was kind of glossed over in their conversation. They just said Live Overflow was pretty firm on, I don't understand why lying and deceiving people is part of security testing. It doesn't seem like a benefit. Like, that's bad. Of course it'll hurt people, but I think that's overlooking how things are scoped. And I'm not saying that John or Live Overflow aren't knowledgeable in this. I'm just saying they didn't talk about it. And so I really want to talk about it. It is very important to acknowledge that these things are scoped. These things are targeted, and there are rules. You cannot do things that are deemed professionally ethical or that are deemed professionally unethical to your target. It's not within the realm of possibility. You will go to jail. Go straight to jail. Do not pass go collect $200, or don't collect $200. So there are rules to this already. So when it comes to phishing in general, I'm all about it. I'm all about social engineering attacks. Social engineering is not just a fancy word, and this is something I disagree. It's not just a fancy word for lying and deceiving. Social engineering is an attack pattern. It is a skill that is learned. There are things you have to do. There are attack primitives that you can carry out. There are kill chains you can conduct, all the fancy buzzwords in OffSec that apply specifically to social engineering or use components of social engineering. I think about cross-site scripting attack, for example, using a reflected XSS to steal session cookies via a phishing email. My payload delivery was sending a malicious email that tricked a user, phishing, social engineering, into clicking a link that opened their browser and then exploited a cross-site scripting vulnerability, technical issue, to steal a cookie. Yeah, that's completely fair game, at least in terms of penetration testing. That would be awesome. Like, now, typically in a pen test, we're only evaluating technical issues. There's no social engineering component. That has to be specifically requested, and usually we're only focused on a red team, or we are doing a very targeted type of social engineering engagement. I think that's very relevant. I think it's extremely important to keep doing that in offensive security. It provides a lot of value. And if clients do know about it, I talked about the clients that don't know about it and the data they can be provided on how it impacts them and how they need to implement training, how they do need to train up their users. That's important. And something that is even more critical, I think, of offensive security organizations is to make sure you communicate that this is not a user problem. One of the things that scares people about social engineering attacks is losing their job because they clicked an email. That's terrible. That's where I agree with John, or can't remember who said it, so sorry if this is one. I know Live Overflow said it for it, but I agree with, and I'm sure John does have this opinion, but I agree with the idea that people shouldn't be losing their jobs over this stuff. That doesn't make any sense. It is important for a consultant to communicate to the client that, hey, this is a flaw in how you train your individual employees. This is a flaw in how you design your business processes even. Maybe it's not even the employee's fault. It's never the employee's fault that they were lied or deceived to. They were lied and deceived to. They fell for a scam, that they are the victim in that case. So maybe a business process needs to change so that way it can be prevented from them being, even the attempt being made. And if all else fails, at least educate the users that this kind of crime exists in the world and they need to be on the lookout for it to the best of their ability. But more importantly, you need to have mechanisms in place that if they do click that link and they do type in that password, whatever payload drops, whatever the attacker does with that to pivot into your network from there, you have technical controls, because from there it's a technical attack. You're supposed to have technical controls at that point. Yeah, the first line of defense and all that kind of stuff, it will fail though. It's proven to fail. Humans are not perfect. You can train as much as you want and you can reduce your statistic likelihood from that impacting you, but it's going to happen at some point to someone somewhere. We will never fully eliminate that risk. My opinion. But I firmly believe that won't, just because of the fact that humans aren't perfect. We're just people. Nobody should be losing their job over this kind of stuff, and technical controls can be implemented to help have that defense in depth. And that's something that I preach on pretty heavily, is defense in depth. Don't have your first line of defense be your only line of defense. Your firewall is not your only protection. Your users aren't even your protection to begin with. They just need to be vigilant where they can be. All that to say, we haven't even answered the question. A beginner-friendly step-by-step phishing tutorial is actually unethical because of the beginner-friendly nuance again. I think a phishing tutorial is important. As a offensive security professional, it's important to learn the skills of phishing and social engineering. It's important to learn how to stand up infrastructure. Now, personally, I put some of that kind of information behind a paywall. That's what my offensive security Udemy course is about. I have a section there that teaches you kind of how to set up GoFish, for example. You know, there are tools in tradecraft that are industry standard now that we use, and there's better ways to implement that stuff with stuff like Evil Engine X. John has a great tutorial for, talked about it a little bit in that video. There are other, the set toolkit is still a popular one from back in the day that's been actively developed, I think, in recent years. Still does some cool stuff. GoFish, like I said, is awesome. GoClone is another one if you just need a quick website cloner. There are tools that exist that are industry standard, and it is worthwhile to make tutorials in the public, not just behind a paywall like I do. In the public, I think it's worthwhile to make tutorials on how to use these things, so that way people are trying to get into this. I don't really want to teach new people on my team how to use GoFish. I will. You know, I don't expect that to be common knowledge, but if you came in the door ready to go, like you knew how to fish and everything because you learned from public resources, that's great. Now, those kind of things I think are completely ethical. What's not ethical is teaching how to configure full-on services with simple click, maybe going through. John has like some videos of exploring the dark web and going and buying phishing websites that are pre-made. I don't think doing that is ethical. Not making the video, but I think the video is great to spread awareness that they exist and get them taken down. But I think people using those is unethical because that is like super, super one click. And if you're just making a tutorial to teach people how to do that and that's all it's for, that's pretty unethical. I think it's also pretty unethical to make like a really easy script that sets up reverse proxies and sets up your infrastructure for you, and you just teach somebody how to do that in a beginner-friendly format. Now, that said, setting up phishing infrastructures costs money, takes time, and is, even if you do it on a local server that you host and port forward out, that's super technical, super in-depth. I don't think there is really such thing as a beginner-friendly step-by-step phishing tutorial. Maybe on how to craft a phishing email, which maybe that's a little bit unethical. I think so. I would lean on unethical in that case. Maybe on how to build in payloads really easily, like if you do it in a step-by-step way to copy paste in just into something that you could send an email and fire it off, that's unethical. But realistically, outside of those things, the way phishing exists in the current meta of things, so to speak, is very technical to implement. It's very difficult if you don't have any background knowledge at all. I don't think you can have a beginner that has no background knowledge copy paste from a tutorial, because they have to set up actual infrastructure to do it. I think the closest you can get to an unethical tutorial is teaching somebody how to craft a phishing email that's super effective step by step. I think that might be pretty unethical because it's pretty intuitive to do if you have any kind of rational thought and you already have the technical know-how. I don't think your hurdle is going to be crafting the malicious email. I think it's going to be setting up the phishing infrastructure. So I think if you can come up with a way to do a beginner-friendly step-by-step phishing tutorial, I think that's unethical. I think you should not do that. But I think all the technical tutorials are fairly ethical. All right, so let's take a look at what John Live Overflow said. So they said that, can there be unethical hacking tutorials and courses in general? They both said yes, I agree with this. A beginner-friendly step-by-step phishing tutorial is unethical. Live Overflow said it's ethical from John's perspective. So with this nuance, if you could create a true beginner-friendly step-by-step phishing tutorial and how I've defined it personally and how I think about it, I agree with Live Overflow. I think it would be unethical. I think the technical things, I even think what John did, I think he marked it as ethical because he made that Nginx kind of tutorial. I think his tutorial is ethical. I don't think that falls into the vein of beginner-friendly step-by-step phishing tutorial. That's my opinion, but I do agree with Live Overflow just on principle. If you can make something that is super beginner-friendly, cut and paste, anybody can do it, that would be unethical. A beginner-friendly step-by-step SQL injection tutorial, they both said ethical. I agree. Beginner-friendly step-by-step malware development tutorial. John said ethical, Live Overflow said unethical. Now, again, the nuance here, I agree. It's unethical to make it super beginner friendly. Just go learn how to program. Now, John said ethical. I know he's made some videos on how to write some basic scripts and stuff that are targeted. I actually don't think there's a whole lot wrong with making security focused programming tutorials. If you wanted to make a tutorial on how to write a man-in-the-middle proxy, for example, using Python, you still got to know how to write Python first though. So if that's the project, the capstone project you want to build for your beginner friendly development for the security tool, be it a piece of malware or a man-in-the-middle proxy or whatever have you, then I'd say go for it, as long as you're actually teaching programming to a degree. Now, you don't want to just give people ransomware and release to the public, but again, if you know how to program, I already talked about it, ransomware is just a file encryptor and decryptor. That exists everywhere. You can buy those as legitimate software. You can find them in open source projects on GitHub and weaponize them if you wanted to. It's not about the software. It's about the knowledge and the principles that you're teaching people on what the software is for. So I think a beginner-friendly tutorial that's teaching malware development, unethical. I know I'm beating a dead horse and I've talked about all this already, but I'm just resonating with their opinions and how they responded and why they responded. Publicly sharing a proof of concept for an unpatched vulnerability. Live Overflow said neutral with a bunch of asterisks. So he was neutral but leaning ethical, because he was perfectly fine with dropping O days in general, but he does recognize that some harm can come from this. So he leans towards this being ethical, but he's neutral because he kind of recognizes that there could cause harm. John thinks this is fairly unethical. I am 100% this is ethical. I have no problems with this. Publicly sharing details about an unpatched vulnerability. They both found this to be ethical because you're just sharing details about the vulnerability. Somebody can reverse engineer and find it, but it's more restricted than just dropping the ODA entirely. So they both think this is ethical. I agree. Sharing a proof of concept exploit for a patch vulnerability. They both think is ethical because the patch is already released. Lying to or deceiving somebody is unethical, they both said. I'm neutral. It kind of depends. Professionally, it's completely unethical, and I agree. Personally, who am I talking to and for what purpose? That's going to depend on how I respond. That's more of a personal philosophical question. And then last but not least, a beginner-friendly step-by-step tutorial on how to use an exploit script for a 0-day is Live Overflow says unethical, John's neutral. I found this to be pretty unethical only from the beginner-friendly nuance. I think a general tutorial for the general public, a write-up, anything like that that's helpful for professionals, I use them all the time. They exist, and I think they're very helpful, and I find those to be fairly ethical. But just a copy-paste, super beginner-friendly, you can open terminal on and be hacking stuff, not know what you're doing, not know what kind of damage you're causing. I think that's fairly unethical. All right, so that's my opinion on everything, my hot takes, so to speak. I hope you enjoyed the video. Last little bit of information. I am working on a new course, but what's really special about this course is I'm also working on a book. So I'm going to be making a course. It is called OST Development, Offensive Security Tooling Development. You can kind of see how that was relevant to the ethics conversation. This course is going to teach you how, as an offensive security professional, to write your own tools in many different contexts. We're going to be exploring web applications, so we're going to be writing things like JavaScript payloads for XSS, phishing pages for credential storage. We're going to be developing scripts for authentication attacks, so like things like password spraying and brute forcing scripts and logins to SMB. Even our own man-in-the-middle proxies and things like that. We're going to build them from scratch to show you how things work. But we're also, in each one of these steps, we're going to be talking about the automated tools that already exist for professionals in your career that you may have already touched before. And this kind of can give you the information that you need to kind of link the two together. So you know, hey, if this isn't working how I need to, or if I want to extend this tool, you now have the abilities to do that. And of course, we also are going to be talking about binary toolkit development. So this is basically writing malware to some extent. Now, big asterisk, I'm going to say this in the course as well, this is actually just a programming course. It's not really anything else. I'm just teaching you how to program. In fact, we're going to go so line by line fundamental that I'm teaching you how to program. Now, I do require you to have some background programming knowledge. You should know a little bit, but this kind of goes in the vein of what I was talking about, where if your capstone goal is to make a C2 server, which is one of the things that we make in the course, then what I'm going to be teaching first are things like how to read and write files, how to run system commands. We're going to be doing very, very basic programming to get you up to stuff. Now, I'm not going to be teaching things like data structures. I'm not going to be teaching things like the fundamentals of compilers and all that kind of stuff. We're not truly, this isn't programming 101. This is more like programming 103, 104, but then we're applying it to security purposes. So that's what this course is going to be about. I'm about a third of the way done with it. And even when I'm done with it, I'm not going to be releasing it just yet because I have to work on the book. So the book I'm writing is going to be a book that is a compilation of both my offensive security engineering course and this course when it releases. And it will have all kinds of goodies in there, so you can have a physical copy of that you just have on your person, even if you don't want to pay for the course. Maybe that you like that learning format better. I'm working on that. So yeah, that's to come. I hope you're excited for it. I hope you check it out. If you haven't already, go check out my offensive security engineering course on Udemy. And yeah, I mean, stay tuned for that. I think it's going to be a ton of fun. And that lets you know where my ethics lie. Peace out.